Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Podolsky. I'm with the Local Government Commission. I'm a project manager here. I just wanted to let everyone know that we are going to wait just a couple minutes, maybe 2-3 minutes here, to see if we have some additional guests that would like to join us before we dive in. So just wanted to get on and let everyone know we thank you for joining, and we look forward to the discussion. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad everyone could join us today. Again, my name is Laura Podolsky. I am a project manager at the Local Government Commission, and I will be the host of today's webinar and also the facilitator. So I'd like just to begin to say how excited we are to be setting up this webinar and to share what we believe is a truly innovative approach to neighborhood revitalization and helping communities manage this glut of foreclosed, vacant, and abandoned properties. We were first introduced to the Center of Community Progress, who will be featured on today's webinar. We were first introduced to their work at our New Partners for Smart Growth conference earlier this year. And ever since, we have been in discussion with them to really see how their work might transfer to California, given the high rates of foreclosures and loss of redevelopment. Turns out that they were thinking the same thing about California and how their tools and approaches might apply and be useful to California communities. So therefore, we thought one of the best ways to figure out if California communities are struggling with neighborhood stabilization, especially the funding part, and with managing foreclosed properties is by going directly to those on the ground working on these issues, such as those that are on the line today. So we're really thankful to have your participation today. So given this webinar is going to be a little bit different than others that you've probably participated in. Our speaker, Amy Hovey from the Center of Community Progress, she's going to share some of her organization's work and provide a brief presentation going over some of the tools and her previous work in other communities. And then we're going to have a group conversation where we want to hear from everyone on the line about some of the issues in your communities and what you're facing related to neighborhood stabilization and managing foreclosed and abandoned homes. So we really hope and expect everyone on the line can contribute and help figure out if the tools that Amy will be talking about might work in your community, and really what are the needs in California communities. So to go over today's agenda, we will, obviously I'm providing the welcome. Amy will provide a quick 20-minute overview presentation and then a group dialogue. Some logistics up front. Everyone will be on mute during the presentation, but during group discussion we will have unmuted everyone, so we will be able to hear your side conversations with coworkers or other things, so just be aware of that. And then in a way to better facilitate questions, we're asking folks to use this raise hand function, and you'll see that up by your name in that right-hand panel of your webinar control panel. So if you press that raise hand function, I'll be able to see that you have a question, and I can call on you. And alternatively, you can type your question into that question box that you'll also see in that webinar control panel. As for the next steps after this webinar, just to talk about some of the resources, is that we'll have the presentation up on our webinar, and that is the location. We can also send this out in an email to everybody today. So some of the questions that we will be leading off our group discussion on, I've posted up here just so that everybody can have these in their minds and be thinking about them and being ready for that group discussion. So you'll see some of the questions that we're kind of curious to hear from you today. So with that, I'd like to introduce Amy and to kick off the webinar. So Amy Hovey is the interim president and CEO of the Center for Community Progress. The Center for Community Progress launched in January 2010 and was born out of the merger of the Genesee Institute in Michigan and the National Vacant Properties Campaign. The mission of this organization is to help communities address the rising stock of vacant and abandoned properties that ultimately is undermining our neighborhood's social, physical, and economic viability. Amy, she has some really interesting background and experience. So before helping to launch the Center for Community Progress, Amy founded the Protogenia group in 2002. And at this firm, Amy provided technical assistance in several areas, including organizational development, leadership development, board governance, administrative management, and program and real estate development. She also provided support specifically to Genesee County in the creation of their land bank authority, and land banking is something that she'll be going into more detail on today's presentation. Prior to Protogenia, Amy was a program director with the Michigan State Office of the Local Initiative Support Corporation. Amy worked with local community development corporations, government agencies, and for-profit businesses, promoting collaboration among community organizations to revitalize urban neighborhoods. And Amy has also had 4 years in private business, working in management, finance, and community relations with First of America Bank. So with that introduction, I would like to hand it over to Amy to share some of the work that she's doing at the Center for Community Progress. Amy?
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Laura. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy that you guys are participating in this webinar. As Laura said, it's really a kind of a two-way conversation for most of the time that we have today. I'm going to very quickly go through this presentation. It's very long, actually, in slides, and so some of them I might skip, or I may kind of go through quickly, but I wanted to include some of the additional slides so that when it's posted, you'll have that access to that, maybe a little bit of a deeper dive on some of this information. I just want to check in. Can everyone, Laura, can you hear me okay? Okay.
I can hear you, Amy.
Okay, great. And so a little bit about community progress, as Laura mentioned, it's really a merger of two organizations, the Genesee Institute and the National Vacant Properties Campaign. So while the organization itself is just a couple years old, 2.5 years old or so, the staff of our organization has been working on these issues around community revitalization and tackling blight and vacancy in communities for a very long time. And we have found that there was a need in our country and throughout the communities to really dig deeper on these issues and to bring them to more of a focus in communities. And that's why the Center for Community Progress itself was created. Next slide is fine. Laura really went over our mission. So Laura, actually, if you want to step to the next slide, I think we'll actually be fine. We do our work with communities really over 4 main areas, program areas. One is technical assistance and capacity building, where our staff will actually get on the ground with communities and helps them implement programs to deal with vacant and abandoned properties and blight within their communities. We also partner with academic organizations and others to do research so that we can really, one, help solidify the fact that best practices are actually best practices with substantial research that will back that. And also to find new ways and better ways of doing things, trying to figure out what the real problems are in communities, what does the data tell us, what are the best ways to approach, and to share best practices. We also find in many communities that we work in many states that the policies really aren't there to give authorities to the states and to the local municipalities to do what we think that they should do. And 2 of those policies I'm going to talk about today, and one is tax foreclosure reform and the other is land banking. So policy is a big part of what we do. And finally, sharing and strategies with one another. We know that this country is large. Your state specifically is very large, and we're a very small organization. We can't be in every community all the time to help spread the word, and so we really try to invest a lot in communication infrastructure, building networks, having national conferences. We just had the Reclaiming Vacant Properties Conference in New Orleans in June, and we have another conference specifically on land banking coming up in Michigan this year in October, which these venues really allow us to help share information. We also have a very active website that has a toolbox and things where people can pull a lot of good resources to help them get moving in the direction of dealing with vacant abandoned properties. Next. Actually, we can go to the next slide, yeah. So, nope, back one, sorry. Back. Oh. Anyway, as we get to the right side, one of the slide that I really wanted to point out talks about our areas of work, and that why we're talking about land banking and tax foreclosure reform, which are some very important parts of reclaiming vacant properties. There's lots of other things that are in the continuum of dealing with problem properties, and some of those are working on code enforcement and looking at vacant property registrations and the foreclosure crisis and what we can do to deal with that. And definitely once you have these vacant and abandoned properties, what do you do with them, and what are strategies for dealing with land and properties while they're vacant, and new tools for repurposing that. So those are some of the different areas of work that we work on. And we really feel like it's important, if a community really wants to tackle their vacant and abandoned property issues, that they do look at it as a system that could work together, not just siloed systems of, okay, we've got mortgage foreclosure over here and land banking over here, but really how do they all work together? And we usually start in one area and then move forward with communities to really help them hit a little bit in every area within the authority that they have to deal with vacant abandoned properties. So we see code enforcement as an area that's really beginning to grow and is something that we're at Community Progress spending a lot of time doing some initial research and best practices and building our capacity to help communities deal with that as well. Next slide. So that's Community Progress and who we are in a very, very quick synopsis, but let's dig in a little bit to the two main topics that we have today. We'll start with tax foreclosure. Tax foreclosure is not something that people talk about every day, but we find that it's a system that is broke in many communities, and it really leads to increased amounts of vacant and abandoned properties. What is tax foreclosure? Most communities across the country rely on property taxes in order to pay for government services. However, they look very different across the country. Failure to pay for those always has some kind of enforcement, some kind of ramification if people don't pay for those. However, in different communities, it looks very different, and sometimes that enforcement piece isn't where it needs to be and allows properties to kind of linger there in limbo for a very long time, which just adds to problem properties within a community. Next slide. So while I say they look very different, and we're going to get into a lot of those variables in just a moment, there are some common elements, and this slide really kind of just focuses on that. Property taxes are typically a priority lien, meaning they rank over all other liens on a property, such as a mortgage. So if a bank has a mortgage on a piece of property, and while the owner may be paying on the mortgage, if they're not paying on the property taxes, typically that can be foreclosed on, or a lien is placed over the mortgage lien or any builder's liens or other types of liens on property. So it's an important component of keeping ownership in the hands of a private owner is to pay their property taxes. If not, most systems allow for the government or a lien purchaser or someone to trump over other people who may have interest in the property. Non-payment of taxes results in the loss of ownership. That's almost always the case eventually in states across our country. However, in some states, it's really left to linger where there's no one taking ownership. So while the current owner may have lost ownership, in some systems, there's no one owning the property for a long time, and it really adds to preventing the property from being redeveloped. One thing that we do see, which seems like it's a good thing, but often leads to negative ramifications within a community, is that often people, and I mean people, governments, put collecting those taxes as the highest priority in what they're doing, collecting those property taxes. Sometimes it's over how do we keep people in their homes and out of tax foreclosure. Sometimes it's very siloed instead of thinking about the immediate tax collection and maybe selling it to a speculator or selling a lien to a speculator and losing control over that property. Governments will just want to get the money now, and we find that to be very short-sighted, and that's one of the things I'm really going to dig into today, is the fact that collecting money today isn't always the best strategy for a community. And like I said, we'll dig into that in the next couple of slides. So if collecting the taxes is the highest priority, who ends up with the property itself is often not even thought of. So this slide says it's secondary. Often when you're looking in a treasurer's office who's responsible for collecting those taxes, they don't even think about what happens to the actual property after it's sold to someone else, or there's a lien buyer who comes and pays off those taxes. All they think about is those taxes. Unfortunately, that leads to often people who don't actually care about the property being responsible for the property. And we all know where that leads. Irresponsible land ownership or often leads to decrease in property values of surrounding properties, an increase in crime. There's health issues. There's adverse effects on economic development. Can have a lot of strong adverse effects to a community. Next slide. This slide just really talks about different ways in which tax collection is enforced in different communities. Just three basic ways. One is tax lien sales, which you're signing the right to collect those taxes to someone else. So you're not actually selling the property itself, but you're selling the lien on those taxes. So investor will step forward, they'll pay the community, the government, the taxes, and for doing that, they get the right then to foreclose on that property themselves against the property owner. The tax auctions and tax deed or certificate sales is another way in which the government will immediately try to collect the taxes through investors. Judicial foreclosure is probably one of the cleanest ways of tax foreclosure, and because it usually comes with clean title. That's where the whole process actually goes through the court systems, all other liens, and are wiped off of the title, and then the title is given either back to the government to sell typically or to whoever that investor is that was foreclosing on the property. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those because we could be here literally for the next couple of hours trying to dig into those. The next slide. So when we go in and are working with communities and begin to look at their tax foreclosure process, the reason why we are asked to come and help is because of the fact that a lot of systems entrap properties, meaning they allow these properties to kind of linger in this tax foreclosure system for years. In fact, we've been in some states where properties are left there for decades. And that is really the problem. We really want to get a problem or a system that really focuses on predictability, that helps move properties through a tax foreclosure process when they need to be moved through, meaning when they're in hands of people who are not responsible landowners, who aren't living necessarily into those homes, that have basically abandoned the properties. But at the same time, we want to develop systems that protect against people who are homeowners and are just suffering a hardship currently. We want systems that protect those families, that aren't automatically pushing people out of their homes and creating additional vacant properties, but are protecting those families at the same time as is moving in properties that have been abandoned and left disregarded by the current owner. We also want to look at systems that pay attention to the disposition of properties or of the highest lien on those properties. Reason being, putting a piece of property into the land or the hands of an irresponsible landowner really allows the community to lose control over those properties. We like to look at systems, and in Michigan is a good example of a state that has underwent tax foreclosure reform and has built a system that expedites the tax foreclosure process. Meaning it takes 3 years from the time you stop paying your taxes before someone would lose their property rights, but also has provisions in for postponement for homeowners who are going through hardships, and they put that in the locality's hands on whether to grant that postponement. So it's not some burdensome state bureaucratic system that somebody has to kind of finagle themselves through in order to get the postponement. It's done within the local municipality, so it's easy to get through that process. And it also allows the local community to set what standards it will give a postponement for and which standards it won't. So you can actually help kind of address that postponement guidelines based on your community's values, the local municipality's values, and what's happening in the community itself. And then at the end of the process, be able to ensure that whoever is taking new ownership of the properties, which is the ultimate goal, is to get these properties back into reuse and productive. And what we mean by productive is not only are they paying their property taxes, which is very important to keeping our governments running, but also is being used in a productive way to the community. It's an asset. It's adding value to the surrounding properties and to the quality of life of the residents that live there. And in order to do that, you have to put some measures in place to make sure that it's not just willy-nilly who gets these properties or who happens to have the most money at a certain time, which an auction often leads to and tax lien sales often lead to, but really have a process in place where the local community can discern who is the best owner, what is the best use of this property, and help even incentivize that to happen so a property goes from being basically abandoned, people aren't paying the taxes and aren't occupying the property or using it to its potential, to sometimes the best property on the block or to a property that everyone would clearly look to as contributing. Next slide. So if we look at that, what are we trying to achieve? These are things I think I basically already went through, but let's just go over them really quick before we conclude talking about tax foreclosure. Tax collection that's efficient and produces the necessary revenues to operate government. Absolutely. This was where we get to having a timely foreclosure process, being able to sell the properties and collect the property taxes is key. And so while we say we should take the time to make sure we sell them to the right people or we get them back into productive use in the right way that's consistent with the community's goals, that certainly doesn't mean that we don't want them to get back in and that the government's not able to receive the revenues it needs. Fair and equitable is really something else that we focus on when talking and looking at tax foreclosure reform. It's amazing, I think, always to me when we're in a state and really looking at these systems, how often unequitable it is. That some properties get foreclosed on at a certain point and some don't. And a lot of that is because the system can only handle, is built in a way in which it can only handle a certain amount of tax foreclosures a year. And so often communities will just pick, we're going to foreclose on these batch this year and we won't be able to foreclose on this batch until next year. Often what happens is a community forecloses on the properties that are worth the most because they think that's going to generate the most revenue for them in the short run, and will leave maybe some of the lower valued properties kind of lingering out there, which if your purpose is only to make the most amount of money as you can in the short term, that's completely logical. However, when you look at it throughout the full system and you see these properties that then cannot be redeveloped, they can't be reused when they're stuck in a tax foreclosure process for 10 years, it's really ends up having dastardly effects on the community and the property values of those surrounding properties, which then results in less property taxes collected overall. So looking at it in the short term is often not the best way to look at it for a community, even if your goal is collecting the most property taxes. And then finally, of course, a system that produces productive reutilization of the foreclosed properties. Again, just reinforcing getting those properties back into the hands of responsible land ownership who are going to be able to put the properties back on the tax roll and add to the quality of the community. Next slide. This slide is very kind of complex, and I'm going to try to go over it in about a minute because I can see that we're we're starting to run out of time, and I haven't even hit land banking yet. But this is really just talking about how can a community, a government, collect the money it needs and be patient with the disposition of tax foreclosed properties at the same time. And one of the systems that we have used here in Michigan is what we call a delinquent tax anticipation note, which is what that DTAN stands for at the bottom of the slide. And basically what communities do, governments do, is they borrow money at a very low interest rate to cover the taxes that are owed on these properties that are tax delinquent, that are going through tax foreclosure. What that does is that buys them some time in order to be able to sell the properties and dispose of them in the best possible way. And this system has really worked very well in Michigan over the last, I guess it's been 10 or 12 years at this point. And in keeping the governments whole, which is very, very important because governments need money to operate, but also making sure that the properties are not sold at auction in bulk to speculators and that communities lose control over what happens to those properties, but allows the government to have more time in making those decisions. And that really kind of goes into our next slide, which is land banks. Because what we see is, well, if we have a government and a community that says, you know what, yeah, we want to slow that down. We want to put some insurances into place that when we sell tax foreclosed properties, that we're selling them to responsible landowners for uses that are consistent with our community's land use goals. Well, we have to have a mechanism for doing that, and most governments don't have a excess capacity to hold and manage properties. And so, as a result of that tax foreclosure system, we began to look into land banks and land banking and what would that look like to manage those properties. And so what a land bank is exactly that. It's a public authority or nonprofit that was created explicitly to deal with the acquisition, the maintenance, and the disposition of properties. Most of the properties come through the tax foreclosure process, or even, especially now in the last 5 years, also through the mortgage foreclosure process when banks are trying to begin to unload on their inventory. Land banks are designed specifically to do that. Next slide. This slide just really goes over the reasons why have a land bank. So one reason, has been the tax foreclosure system and giving an avenue in which to dispose of those properties. But it's also to deal with, once we have control and ownership of those properties, can we incentivize development? Can we use this to foster partnership between private and public organizations and nonprofit organizations? Some communities actually use their land bank specifically to influence supply and demand, meaning they purposely hold some properties off of the real estate market in order to decrease the supply that's available that's currently on the market, which will help stabilize those values. So we see that happening. People use their land banks just for solely economic development programs, to acquire property to hold for infrastructure changes or for conservancy. So there's lots of different reasons why people use land banks. Next slide. Some of the different roles we see people use land banks for, or roles land banks, actually have in communities, is often these 6 main ones I have on this slide: acting as a community stakeholder and leader. Because they're often a public organization, they're there to help partner with and bring other organizations and agencies on board to talk about what's the best use of this property. And because of that, they often become involved in land use planning as well, and determining with others and consistent with any land use plans or local community plans in place, what's the best use of this property? Who should we sell this property to? In the meantime, while they're holding the property, obviously they need to be really good property owners and managers. We talk about having land banks and redoing tax foreclosure reform. in order to prevent irresponsible landowners from owning properties in our communities, well, we certainly don't want the land bank to be an irresponsible landowner. Often, as well, they will either step into a pre-development role or even a developer role. And let me just talk about that quickly, and then we'll progress through the other slides. What I mean by pre-development is most land banks will take that property and make it developer ready. Meaning if there's environmental cleanup that needs to be done, they'll step forward and get the environmental cleaning up done. If the title is dirty and has lots of different potential owners on there, they'll go through a title clearance process and clear the title and get that in place. If rezoning needs to occur, they will go through that. Or if they think that it's a property that is going to need financial incentives, they may go and try to help find and identify some of those financial incentives in order to attract a developer. So most land banks are there to work with developers in the community and not necessarily do the development themselves. However, in some cases, if they are unable to attract anyone because of the type of development they're looking to occur, meaning it's very difficult, there's not a lot of money to be made in order to attract a developer, they may have to act as a developer of last resort. But more often than not, they will either work in partnership with the developer or pass the property on to a developer. Next slide. What can land banks do? Land banks sell properties. So they acquire properties, but then they also sell them and hope to put them back in productive use. But they can do that through locally developed policies and priorities that reflect what the community's values are. So by not selling it at auction or necessarily even always have to sell it for the highest price they can get for a piece of property, they can make sure through their policies that they're selling it to a responsible landowner. For example, most land banks will have a policy that states that they will not sell a property to someone who has open code violations, meaning if they're not taking care of the properties they already have, they're not eligible to buy another piece of property from the land bank. So you can really tighten up more so than a typical municipality can, who can and who can't buy properties through a land bank. They're also able to sell through negotiated sale. So they don't necessarily have to sell a piece of property for fair market value or for the appraisal price like most municipalities often have to do, but they're able to really take a look at that deal and be able to kind of negotiate what works best. They also take some of the bureaucracy out of a public land sale, meaning it doesn't have to go to city council once or twice and get public hearing, but they can really do it in a more traditional way. Some land banks lease properties as an interim use, meaning to have a rental program. Sometimes that when they're trying to affect supply and demand issues, they will rent the properties in an intermediate way until the market has begun to correct itself and they feel like they can put it back on the market. Other times they get a property through tax foreclosure that has a tenant currently in the house, and rather than evict the tenant, they'll continue in a lease arrangement, or more commonly also is try to sell that property to the tenant themselves. And so with that, they also can get involved in code enforcement and nuisance abatement at the direction and in partnership with the local municipalities. That's usually done in targeted areas. And as I mentioned, they maintain properties with really good maintenance strategies in place. So I know we're getting close, and I really want to hear from all of you. So I'm going to end there, but I do want to say, again, we're having this great land banking conference in October. In Michigan. It's on our website. If you're interested, you can learn a lot more about land banks at that conference, and it's very inexpensive. So hopefully you all will take a look at that. So I think that's it, Laura, if you want me to pass it back to you to facilitate some questions.
Thank you so much, Amy, and I know we only have an hour today, and that was a lot of information. So, and I'm sure that there's questions. So with the remaining 20 minutes that we have, we will unmute everyone, and Jenny in our office is working on that now. So everyone should be unmuted, and you can use that hand raise function that's next to your name in that panel to let me know if you have a question, and then I can just call out your name, and we can try to do this in an organized fashion. So again, sorry about that. I was muted for a minute. So Jenny put up some discussion questions again, so those should be in front of everybody. And so these were some initial questions that I know Amy shared with me, saying, hey, if I receive feedback on some of these things, that would really help in figuring out how some of the tools and approaches she's used could apply to California. So with that, everyone sees kind of questions in front of them. Can you identify some of the types of problem properties you're experiencing in your community? Identify the problem property owners, is it absentee owners, lending institutions, etc., and just describe some of the conditions of your community in regards to vacant and abandoned and underutilized properties. So with that, I do see that Rena Gonzalez, that you have your hand raised. Are you there, Rena? Would you like to ask a question? Maybe Rena is not there. So are there other questions that people have? I don't see anybody raising their hand function, but I'm really hoping some people could offer some insights on some of the challenges they're experiencing in their community in regards to foreclosed homes, vacant, abandoned homes, code enforcement, any of those issues.
I mean, are people having any issues even more with residential homes that are a result of mortgage foreclosure? Do they see tax foreclosure as an issue? Or is it more that maybe there are properties that aren't being fully utilized, or that are being utilized but maybe are blighted and acting as a deterrent in a community? We really want to learn a lot about what's happening in California. We're not really familiar with your communities yet, and we're really trying to learn as much as we can. So any information you guys can give us would be very helpful. So Rena, wherever you are, please come back.
Bob Smith, do you have a question or a comment? I hope this is working correctly. I see that Bob Smith has raised his hand, but maybe your audio isn't working, is that right? Bob, you can also type your question. There's a question box in that webinar panel, so maybe I'll try to send him something as well.
This is Molly Wright from Sacramento. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I wanted to say that Michigan seems like it's very different, from Sacramento. The majority of foreclosures I know of have been mortgage foreclosures. Mm-hmm. The vast majority. And in my neighborhood, I haven't seen issues with, blighted properties for long. A lot of foreclosed houses get snapped up pretty quickly with short sales. But there are other neighborhoods in Sacramento where I know that there are some abandoned properties that have created some issues.
Right. So in your neighborhood, you're saying the short sales system seems to be working fine. It gets it back into mostly the same use with a quality land owner or property owner?
Yes.
Okay. And do you have any idea what is the result of maybe some of the reason for vacant and abandoned properties in those other neighborhoods in your community?
They are simply not very fashionable neighborhoods.
Okay, so there's no market?
Perhaps, what?
So the market is not there?
Yes, I
aren't
guess that's
wanting.
a better way to put it. The market is not there, but I know that I live in a neighborhood where there are a lot of older houses, very nice houses, and you know, I've seen that they've been snapped right up because I think people look at the short sale as an opportunity. So, you know, where there's a house that has potential for very high value that's being sold at rock bottom prices, they get snapped up immediately.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so do you feel like your community is able to meet whatever its land use goals are, whether that is plenty of places for economic development to occur, affordable housing? I mean, is everyone happy with the trajectory of where things are headed?
That's a broad question. I can't really, I mean, that's a broad question. That's a broad question. Obviously, conditions could always improve.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. In what ways? I mean, like, what is it? Just trying to get a little bit better handle on if there is anything that we might be able to do to help. So are there people not taking care of their properties? Or, I mean, especially in those areas that you say have no market, what is the reason why there is no market? Is it because the properties are a little substandard? Or is it crime?
There's a perception of crime.
Okay.
Oh.
I just say it because we often see that there's a high correlation between the perception of crime and vacant abandoned properties.
Yes.
Okay.
So we have another person that's raised their hand too. So JD, would you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah. I was just saying that what we're experiencing here in Riverbank is the mortgage foreclosures, and then people are buying on a short sale, but what's going on is that they're really being used as rental properties. We're having an influx of renters, and that caused some, you know, it's just rental properties just don't look the same as home ownership.
Right. So what do you guys have for measures there as far as helping to control the physical appearance of your rental properties? Do you have rental registration or rental inspections, or is it just whoever wants to rent their house is able to do that?
Whoever wants to rent a house is able to do that. We don't have to do that. We're really, you know, we have no staff. We have no planning staff.
Oh.
There's, you know, we have one code enforcement officer. You know, it's not it's just not the funding.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a way to financially encourage home ownership for our local residents, we're most interested in.
So I have a couple questions just as a follow-up to your comment, JD. One is if we were able to help you find ways in which to manage the influx of rental properties in your community that would pay for itself, meaning there would be funds to help increase the capacity, hire people to help manage that process, is that something that you think your community would be interested in?
Yes.
Okay. And then because there are ways in which to do those types of programs that actually pay for themselves, because we know that most local governments across the country do not have excess money or capacity to take on new initiatives. But if they're designed in a certain way, often they can be operated in a way in which they're self-sufficient, meaning they don't take money from the general fund. And then secondly, do you think that if it wasn't for the short sale, meaning if it wasn't just in the hands of the mortgage companies to decide who was going to purchase or not purchase those properties. Do you think that they could be moved into the hands of homeowners? Do you think there's a market for more homeowners there? And it's just because the speculators are coming in, or the investors, I should say, are coming in with ready cash that's more attractive to banks?
Yeah, I think it's really, you have ready cash ready to invest, and the banks are looking at, they want to, they're losing money. They want to get their money back as rapidly as possible. So,
there could be homeowners that would be interested in purchasing those homes.
Yeah. We have and it kind of goes back. We have home funds that we have a first-time home buyers that we have a waiting list for, but there's seems like there would be a way for a land bank to maybe get have the ability to work with the home funds and get home buyers and leverage those. We can get first-time home buyers into homes that are available.
Yeah, absolutely. Many do that, and honestly, we see that banks are very interested in working with land banks to help with the disposition of their foreclosed properties. I think they're beginning to trust land banks a lot more and know that land banks are a member, they're a member of that community, meaning they're going to make sure that the properties get put back into reuse, which is consistent with your goal of home ownership versus adding more rentals to your neighborhood. So I think you're exactly right. Land banks are perfect for that.
I mean, there's a rental market, but I mean, the rentals should be, there's a design for rentals, and most single-family homes are not designed for that property, a fundamentally different design.
Do you know where your rental versus home ownership rate is looking like in your community? Like what percentage are rentals of the residential properties?
I haven't had a chance to look at the most recent, but it's hovering right around in the 40%.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, those are pretty typical issues that we're seeing across the country that we would love to be involved in helping you take a look at.
Cool.
I have a question, Amy. This is Laura, and you've come out here before, and Dan Kildee, the past president and CEO of Center for Community Progress, has come out here, and he's met with some individuals in Stanislaus County and other places, with JD being one of them. And one of the questions in setting up a land bank, what would be around kind of the area you would be looking at to set up this land bank? So for instance, JD Hightower at the city of Riverbank, the city is about, is it 20,000 in population, JD?
Yeah, about 23, yeah.
23,000. So would, if you were to, if a community or municipalities, they were thinking, okay, we want to do this land bank to try to better release foreclosed or stressed properties, either if they're going through a mortgage foreclosure or tax foreclosure, we want to do this, we think it might be a good idea. What scale would you be really looking at? I mean, would City of Riverbank need to be thinking about this on a county-wide level and getting other partners involved, or could they just do one for their city or for a neighborhood?
Okay, that's a good question.
That's a really good question.
The answer isn't that easy, though. We typically like to see land banks at the largest metropolitan area it can be, so typically counties are good ways to look at them because you get a more diverse real estate market in which to help kind of balance out what comes in and out of the land bank. Because one of the ways in which a land bank does make money to sustain itself is sometimes it gets properties through that it can actually make a profit on. But then often it gets lots of properties through that you're not making a profit on it. You're doing some demolition, or you're selling it at a discount just to get it rehabbed and back into the market. But that doesn't mean that a single municipality, as small as 23,000, in population could not start their own land bank, at least first. So it really, it depends on what's happening in that community and where the political will is. So, and I'll just give you an example. In Michigan, we have great land banking legislation that really gives a lot of good powers to land banks, which I didn't go over in this presentation simply because they're specific to Michigan, and if you guys were thinking about land banking legislation at some point, we'll begin to share all those with you. But it really looks at land banks being created at a county level. So almost all of the land banks in Michigan are at a county level. However, we do have a small city who has their own land bank. Because their county wasn't interested in starting the land bank, they couldn't gain the political support to get one created at a county level, so they created their own city land bank. And why that's interesting is that not all land banks look alike. Some of them are actually inside of city government and are staffed by city government. Sometimes they may be staffed by nonprofit staffing. Sometimes they may be a part of another authority. So you may have like a, I know this isn't a great word in California these days, but in other places you may have a redevelopment authority in which will have a land banking arm. So you don't have to have this huge infrastructure necessarily where you're hiring all these new people and you have this big budget in order to do land banking. Sometimes they use existing capacity within, you know, like I mentioned, within the city infrastructure itself, their departments, or within another agency to be able to do land banking programs and tools. So there's no set rule.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was helpful at all, but we just really see them in all shapes and sizes. Obviously, as I mentioned, if you can get a good, diverse real estate market, it's easier to help the land bank become self-sufficient much more quickly. But that certainly doesn't preclude smaller municipalities from starting one. I would never think that you should do it at like a neighborhood level. That would be way too small. But you could start at a city if that's where you felt like it was the best place to start. You know, Chicago, Cook County, we're working with them at starting a land bank. And one of the things some of their municipalities did is, instead of having the whole county, which is being very slow at starting its land bank, they had a couple municipalities, 3 specifically, that came together and started a land bank. And then when the county gets theirs up and running, they may get absorbed into that land bank. They may partner with that land bank. They don't really know what that's going to look like yet, but they didn't want to wait and sit around until politically a larger one could be started, even though they kind of all know that the larger one is probably the better way to go. But rather than waiting years for that to get started, they're starting their own smaller land bank right now.
That's great. Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you everyone for joining today. We are 2 minutes away from 11, so I did want to do a little bit of wrap up for this webinar. Again, Amy's contact information is up there, her email's up there. Yes, Amy, did you want to share something?
I just wanted to make a little plug. You know, we're really, as I mentioned, trying to learn as much as we possibly can about your communities. If you all have any good research or reports or anything that you want to share with us, good articles, you know, please use my contact information and forward it on to us. We would really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. So, so again, we want to collect as much information as we can. I think that there is an intent and vision for the Center for Community Progress to start figuring out, okay, how would they work with communities in California? How many states are you in right now, Amy, working in?
Gosh, I think that we're probably working in about 12 states right now.
So 12 states, and really with the loss of redevelopment, you know, local government commission, we know that was funding a lot of communities depended on to do some of the revitalization efforts, and so we're really excited that this is a way that local governments could potentially intercept some funding that is going to those private speculators. And as a new homeowner myself, I did follow a home that was going through foreclosure, and I did go to the courthouse steps, and I saw that I couldn't compete with those that had that money in their pockets ready to go. And so that was really interesting and motivating for us to really look at, is that the best way to be releasing these properties into the market, selling them at auction to whoever has, $200,000 in their pocket, which is not necessarily me as a new homeowner. So again, we want to keep the conversation going. We'll be sending out the link where you can have a video of the webinar. It'll be an audio recording of the webinar. I'll send out the questions again, so please take some time, maybe talk to some other people in your department. If you have to, talk to your code enforcement officers. Any information you can get back to us would be really great, and then we would hope that we can hopefully advance and see if the Center for Community Progress can come out and do some preliminary exploring and get a lay of the land and see how their tools might help communities in California. So with that, thank you again, Amy, for taking the time to share your work with us, and thank you for everyone who's able to participate today.
Thanks.